There are two theme park giants that call the Orlando area home, the Walt Disney World Resort and the Universal Orlando Resort. They both have their pros and cons. Some families are going to prefer one over the other, but there's one thing that's for certain. Every year, literally millions of families from around the world choose either of these places, or in some cases both, to spend their vacations. And every family's different, so which park is right for your family, that's going to depend on any number of factors. But no matter which one you choose, if you're thinking about making a trip in 2026, there are some things that you might want to know. So today I want to go through all of them. We're going to talk a little bit about Walt Disney World and the Universal Orlando Resort to include all of the theme parks, even Epic Universe. Because sure, you can just choose dates and book your tickets, but I think it's better to go in knowing what to expect. So let's cover all of that today, and we're starting with Walt Disney World. 2026 is a really big year for the Walt Disney World Resort, especially when it comes to construction, maintenance, projects. There's a lot going on, and it's happening at 3 of the 4 theme parks. Now, this is something that we've talked about a few times, especially around middle to the end of last year, as new announcements of new projects came out and timelines started to look a little bit more solidified. We had a lot of conversations about whether or not 2026 was a good time to visit the Walt Disney World Resort. And I'm not going to go over all the details of those discussions with you now, but I will say that it really depends on what your wants are as a family when it comes to a Disney vacation. And I encourage you to think about that before booking your trip in 2026. Because while I do think that you can have a fantastic time at the most magical place on earth, even if there is a lot going on, there is no way around the fact that it will in some way or another impact your visit, especially with so much happening all at once, and that's on top of all the regular maintenance and upkeep that happens on an annual basis anyway. Is it manageable for some families and not that big a deal? Absolutely, but for others, this might be a year where you hang up those Mickey ears so that you can revisit them at a later date. Use 2026 as an excuse to visit some other place, whether it's here in the Orlando area or somewhere else in the country or somewhere else in the world. So before we really talk about anything else related to Walt Disney World and the things you need to know, we really need to talk about this and make sure that we understand what exactly we're getting into when we book that Walt Disney World vacation for 2026. I do think that it's important to realize there are going to be construction walls, there's going to be construction noise. You can hear the heavy machinery happening just on the other side of said construction walls. This can also cause a lot of dust in the air, which can be a problem for some people, especially if you have a sensitive respiratory system. So be aware of that. Maybe grab one of those masks out of the closet that you had from 2020 and bring that with you, because that can minimize some of the dust that you might experience, especially on windy days at places like Magic Kingdom and Animal Kingdom with all the work that's been going on. But also on top of all this work can sometimes cause bottlenecks. Things can feel a little bit more crowded than they would have otherwise. Also, sometimes the construction walls can block airflow and things can feel even hotter. We've already seen this at places like Haunted Mansion, thanks to construction walls up blocking the view to the rivers of America. So just be ready for this. Know it's going to be part of the experience. Also, with all of the work that's going on, it's really important to expect the unexpected, especially when it comes to ride closures or attractions opening ahead of schedule. In the past year alone, Disney hasn't always been great to sticking to their schedule. Sometimes they'll close something a little bit early. A great example of this was Rock and Roller Coaster closing their pre-show early. Sometimes things take longer to complete than expected and they open late. But even if a new attraction opens early, that can draw crowds that you might not necessarily be expecting to see during your visit. So just remember to stay flexible. That's really important if you're thinking about a trip to Walt Disney World in 2026. The next thing to keep in mind when it comes to visiting the Walt Disney World Resort in 2026 is that Disney's priorities seem to be shifting, and the definition of what is a Disney vacation is changing. This is something we talked about a few weeks ago, maybe it was more like a month ago at this point. I shared some of my insights as to what I've seen shifting and changing at the Walt Disney World Resort, especially in the past year, and a lot of you had a lot to say as well. Of course, if you want to go back and hear everything that I have to say about that specific topic, I'll put a link in the description box down below. But for the sake of today's discussion, I think it's important to realize that things here at Walt Disney World, they're shifting. They're turning into something that is slightly different from what you might be familiar with, from what you might be comfortable with. And this is happening in more ways than one. I mean, we could talk about things like quality and customer service, but there are also other ways in which the Disney experience is shifting, including all of the changes that are coming to Disney's Animal Kingdom. It seems that the park itself is maybe in a transitional period. Maybe it's redefining itself. And of course, in some ways, this is just part of it, you know, like things change over time, things update, but in other ways, it's not quite the product that it used to be. And I think it's really important to recognize that going in, especially if this is going to be your first trip in a few years. Now, it wouldn't be a conversation about the Walt Disney World Resort if we didn't take a second to talk about the cost. Now, look, I'm not going to go over specifics right now because depending on when you're watching this, you know, maybe you're watching it in the moment, maybe you're watching it a couple months from now, the price may very well be different. Nonetheless, it's still important to take a second and talk about a few things, including some of the scuttlebutt about what might be coming to the Walt Disney World Resort in the future. So first, there's the standard stuff. We should probably take a second to talk about that. Generally speaking, Disney does like one major price increase annually around the end of the year, but it's also not uncommon to see Disney raise prices on pretty much anything else they choose to raise prices on, especially toward the end of the year. This is when we see the increase in ticket prices, the increase in food, but also the increase in pretty much anything else that you can think of. Sometimes you'll see some outlets talk about this like it took them by surprise. It really shouldn't. It's basically scheduled at this point, so make sure it doesn't catch you off guard. Purchase your tickets if you're planning on traveling toward the end of the year or early 2027 before those price increases take effect. But another thing that I think is worth mentioning, and we don't have any official word on this quite yet, but still I want you to be aware of it, is that Disney's been talking about going with something called dynamic pricing, which essentially is a model that would allow ticket prices to change in real time. Think the same way that airlines work, you know, how much a plane ticket costs today versus tomorrow for the same plane ticket, depending on when you buy it. It's very confusing, it's very frustrating, and it's something that Disney's thinking about doing. Now, currently, Disney's ticket prices do vary based on the day. So a ticket during the busiest time of the year is going to be more expensive than during the slow season. But this is an entirely different thing. And again, we don't have any official word on this yet, but I do think it's important to add to this discussion because when it happens, like so many other things that have been happening at the Walt Disney World Resort, I think it's going to happen in the blink of an eye, and I don't want you to be taken by surprise. So know that this is something that might be on the horizon. It probably will be on the horizon, but we don't officially know when or how it will be implemented. Just know that it's a thing. And last but not least, we need to talk a little bit about travel habits. Now, this is important for those of you who are, you know, you're kind of flexible with your travel plans, you're trying to find the perfect time to visit. Unfortunately, we're still kind of trying to figure that out over here. This is another conversation that we've had in the recent past. I'll put a link to this one in the description box down below as well. But the long and short of it is crowds are still pretty unpredictable. So there are some things that you can do in order to try and find the perfect dates for you and your family, especially if you're trying to avoid crowds. But it's important to recognize that sometimes that doesn't work out the way you expect. So being flexible is really important. Expecting the unexpected is really important. And quite frankly, I feel like that kind of sums up all of our feelings when it comes to visiting Walt Disney World in 2026. You need to be flexible and you need to expect the unexpected. But that all having been said, to wrap up Walt Disney World in a nice little bow before moving on to Universal, if you're thinking about visiting in 2026, be flexible, have a plan B, Expect the unexpected, that's really important. Be ready for price hikes, especially as we get toward the end of the year. They are coming. How exactly that will work is still TBD, but things are probably going to be more expensive toward the second half of the year than they are right now. And keep in mind that there's a lot of work going on. A ton, in fact, and it's going to be happening throughout the year and impacting most of the parks, 3 of the 4, but I do think that Disney's Animal Kingdom and Hollywood Studios are going to be the hardest hit. So if you're thinking of skipping a couple parks, those might be the ones to skip. Next, let's talk about the Universal Orlando Resort. Now, like Walt Disney World, there is some work happening over here as well in 2026, but unlike Walt Disney World, I don't think it's going to be as invasive or widespread here at the Universal Orlando Resort, with one exception, but it's not necessarily going to impact every family in the same way. Still, I want to make sure that you're informed, so let's go through this list. First on the list, we got to talk about Volcano Bay, which is scheduled to be down for maintenance for a significant amount of time. In fact, you can't even buy Universal's 3-park annual pass right now, which includes Volcano Bay. So this is going to be a lengthy refurbishment, which without a doubt will really impact some families, especially those who love Volcano Bay and those who are staying at the resorts that are like walking distance from Volcano Bay, but it's not necessarily going to impact everyone equally. Of course, I'd love to know where you stand on this. Is Volcano Bay a must-do for you? Is it something that you usually skip? Tell me about it in a comment down below. Now, when it comes to big construction news, we can't not talk about what's going on over at Islands of Adventure in the Lost Continent. Now, this is clearly going to be a ton of work, and we don't really know what Universal is doing with that space yet, but I hesitate to say that this is going to have a huge impact on guest experience at Islands of Adventure, mainly because the area is currently so underutilized. Now, there are a few places to grab a bite to eat. Mythos is over there, which a lot of people love, that table service restaurant. And of course, depending on how the construction is done, that might mean that we don't have a nice loop of the park. We'll just have to wait and see. There are 2 things that I know for sure, though. One is that something is happening, and the other is that we don't really know anything about it. So I'll keep you posted. We also have work happening over at Universal Studios Florida on what used to be Rip Ride Rockit. It's kind of spilling out into City Walk at the moment, but again, this isn't really impacting the experience of Universal Studios Florida. It's really just one section at the moment that is under construction. And then there is work set to happen at Epic Universe as well. To the best of my knowledge, I think this is happening in the Harry Potter area, but don't quote me on that. We also know that there's another restaurant that's set to open in Epic Universe. I don't know if we have dates on that quite yet, but again, I would describe this as non-invasive when it comes to experiencing the park. That all having been said, I think it's important to know about the work, understand that it might impact you, maybe, but it's certainly not going to have a major impact on your visit to the Universal Orlando Resort, no matter what theme park we're talking about, with the exception of Volcano Bay. Now, another major update coming to Universal Orlando, which I think is really important to make note of, is that Epic has been added to the multi-park ticket. So if you're visiting the Universal Orlando Resort, you have a few different ticket types available to you. You can go with a 1-park per day ticket, or you can opt for a multi-park ticket that allows you to move between the parks. Up until recently, Epic Universe wasn't included in the multi-park ticket, but that has since changed, allowing guests to start their day at any park, including Islands of Adventure or Universal Studios Florida, and make their way over to Epic Universe at their leisure. Of course, you can start at Epic and make your way to the other 2 parks whenever you like. Now, I think that adding this option is great, especially because Epic Universe hasn't been without its faults. It's run into some problems. Sometimes guests, they only have 1 day in the park, and there are so many issues that they run into that they just don't get to do something that they really wanted to do. So adding this to the multi-park ticket allows them to hop back over to Epic and do that one thing that they really wanted to do before they head back home after their vacation. But there are some potential problems, and while we haven't seen this play out quite yet, I think it's important to just talk about so that you're aware of it and you can prepare accordingly. The main concern is crowd levels, which is already a concern for Epic Universe. There are a lot of ways in which Epic is lacking in terms of managing crowds. Attractions aren't really built for the park's capacity, and the park hasn't even really met capacity quite yet. And that has a number of people, myself included, concerned about what Epic Universe is going to look like if anyone can hop on over at their leisure. This is especially concerning if Islands of Adventure and Universal Studios Florida continue to close as early as they do, whether it's for standard park operations or because of special events. You can easily hop on over to Epic Universe, which usually closes much later, but what is that going to look like when it comes to crowds? The simple answer is we just don't know yet, but it is something to be aware of and be prepared for. And ultimately, just like I said when it came to Walt Disney World, be flexible. Have a plan B. Also, on the topic of Epic Universe and ticketing, we have to talk about the fact that there is still no Epic annual pass yet. And based on the fact that Universal Orlando has extended annual pass holder benefits to Epic Universe for another year, I don't think that there's going to be one anytime soon. Now, I know that we kind of already got into this, but I think the main issue, the main reason for this is because Epic just isn't really capable of handling the crowds that it currently has. And with that being the case, I'm just not entirely sure that they are capable of handling the crowds that would come with an Epic Universe annual pass, or maybe even the disappointment if they only offer so many annual passes. Of course, this is disappointing, especially for Universal Orlando's biggest fans. Their pass holders. But it is the situation at the moment, and my best guess is it's going to continue to be the situation throughout 2026. I hope I'm wrong on this, but who knows? One way or another, it just seems like Universal's way of making sure they don't bite off more than they can chew. All that having been said, just to wrap up Universal Orlando, there's definitely a lot going on at this resort as well. Lots of work happening, lots of moving parts, and some changes that you probably want to be aware of, especially if you're thinking about late nights at Epic Universe. But none of it's really a deal breaker. None of it's really going to impact your Universal vacation in a major way, with the exception of Volcano Bay, if that's something that is a must-do for you. Of course, I think it's fair to say that being flexible is a good idea, and especially if you're planning on those late nights at Epic Universe, be ready for some crowds and be ready for a little bit of uncertainty. But there you have it. That's all that I think you need to be aware of if you're planning a 2026 trip to Walt Disney World or the Universal Orlando Resort. Let me know what you think. Are you planning a trip? What are some of the pros and cons of visiting this year for you and your family? Is there anything you think that I left out that I should have included? Tell me in a comment down below. I look forward to hearing what all of you have to say. Until then, enjoy the rest of your day and happy vacation planning.